family. You're tuning into the pro-black perspective on KWAZ Radio. And today, of course, we're going to read Unity and Struggle with Amilcar Cabral. And this is going to be chapter 3, possibly a little more, or maybe I'm just going to cut it up and so forth. This chapter doesn't promise to be entertaining, but we have to remember that Amilcar Cabral was not an entertainer, but a revolutionary. Not everything. And although I'm using social media, which is usually for entertainment, you know, I'm mostly doing this to read it myself, and hopefully you can engage this literature as well, right? So today is chapter 3, and this is about Portuguese colonial domination, and this is the facts about Portugal's African colonies. And I would already guess, and just by the title, that this is the context from which I guess it's Guinea-Bissau engages Portugal militarily. You know, so this is really important on just that basis alone. So it says 11 million Africans suffer under Portuguese colonial domination, right? And just contextualize that 11 million is about 1/4 of the African American population today, right? But of course, this was 50 years ago, 60 years ago. Um, I mean, he didn't say the year yet, but you can gather it was a long time ago. So that was a lot. That was considered a big population back then. So 11 million Africans suffer under Portuguese colonial domination. The Portuguese colonies cover an area of about 2 million square kilometers, about 5% of the entire continent, and larger than the combined areas of Spain, France, Germany, Italy, and England. Can you imagine that? So these colonies are larger than Spain, France, Germany, Italy, and England combined. This small little country has all of that land, right? The African population of these colonies have been enslaved by a small country, the most backward in Europe. Um, and it's important for us to realize that Portugal starts off the European slave trade, right? And the reason behind that, just to give you that, the reason behind that is because it's Portugal and Spain which are colonized by the Moors of, we could say, North Africa, you know, North Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. So after they get that technology and that enslavement network, that's where they rise up as one of the first Europeans to do it. But they're still backwards. The 2 million square kilometers are rich in natural resources. The land supports agriculture and livestock breeding. The subsoil contains iron, coal, manganese, oil, bauxite, diamonds, gold, precious metals, etc. The variety and beauty of nature offer possibilities for tourists. Side by side with these natural riches, some of which are exploited by the colonialists, Africans live on a subhuman standard, little or no better than serfs in their own country. Contempt for Africans. After the slave trade, armed conquests, and colonial wars, there came the complete destruction of the economic and social structure of African society. The next phase was European occupation and ever increasing European immigration into these colonies, into these territories. The lands and possessions, and it's actually important that he says territories instead of colonies, but uh, this is very interesting because you see it says the complete destruction of the economic and social structure of African society. So this is the side that is often neglected in the Western dialogue, which is the side that this is what happened in Africa, as opposed to what happened to the people who were taken from Africa. This is what happened to the people who remained in Africa, who weren't taken. Uh, the lands and possessions of the Africans were looted. The Portuguese sovereignty tax was imposed, and so were compulsory crops for agricultural produce, forced labor, the export of African workers, and total control of the collective and individual life of Africans, either by persuasion or violence. As the size of the as the size of the European populations grow, so does its contempt for Africans. Africans are excluded from certain types of employment, including some of the most unskilled jobs. Racial discrimination is either openly or hypothetically practiced. Africans have been driven from the remaining fertile regions left to them in order that colonatos for Europeans could be built there, right? Um, so again, this is just a discrimination that Africans faced at home. You know, because like I said, we're really familiar with the discriminations that Africans face abroad. But this is more the at home part. So political, social, or trade union organizations is forbidden to the Africans, who do not enjoy even the most elementary human rights. When the United Nations Charter was adopted, giving all countries the right of self-determination, the Portuguese constitution was hastily changed. The name colony was replaced by overseas territory, thus enabling Portugal to claim that she has no colonies and could not therefore make reports on her African territories. As Africans have awakened and begun moving towards freedom and independence, efforts to control and oppress them have been redoubled. A political secret police was created. The colonial army was reinforced. In Portugal, military mobilization was increased, attended by warlike maneuvers and demonstrations of forces. Air and sea bases were built in the colonies. Military observers were sent to Algeria. Strategic plans were drawn up for a war against the Africans. Political and military agreements were made with other colonial powers. New and increasingly advantageous concessions were given to non-Portuguese enterprises. So, and this is also important because when we talk about, or when people do talk about quote-unquote white supremacy, or they talk about conspiracy theories, you know, this is actual, our story, or this is actually history. You know, this is actually what happens. Military observers were sent. This is hard evidence. Strategic plans were drawn up, and you could find these plans. You know, and they were wars against Africans. So the demands of the Africans and the work of their resistance organizations, which are forced to remain underground, have resulted in severe repression. All this was and still is perpetuated in the name of civilization and Christianity by the most retrograde kind of colonial system. Both the human and natural resources of these colonies are exploited and mortgaged at the lowest possible value. The colonialists denied the practice of Christian principles and their lack of reverence for their human. You know, I realize this is kind of too small. I'm just like straining my eyes. Okay, that's a little too big, but okay. Both the human and natural resources of these colonies are exploited and mortgaged at the lowest possible value. The colonialists deny the practice of Christian principles and their lack of reverence for the human being, and they do everything they can to hide the true effects of their civilizing influence. While humanity discovers its unity and strives for a community of interest based on peace and the recognition of the rights of man, of freedom and equality of all people, the Portuguese colonialists prepare to launch new colonial wars. And this is where you really want to go into the thinking of our African predecessors, because in this all you kind of still see this respect for Christianity. You kind of see this buying into the rhetoric, civilizing influence, and then furthermore more rhetoric where he says strive for the community of interest based on peace and the recognition of the rights of man, of freedom and equality of all peoples. And this right here kind of gets into the how we're really colonized by the rhetoric of white folk. And you can kind of see it just permeating throughout like all of this paper, or much of this paper, and then like you could just tell it's going to continue. So flimsy arguments, like who cares about the arguments? Now I'm not saying that. Now of course you want to communicate the failure of the arguments to other people, but for me, I tend to say, you know what, I don't believe it one bit. I would only share the arguments only to say, yeah, it's unbelievable, isn't it? Uh, Portuguese arguments. Sorry, flimsy arguments. Hold on a second. Portuguese colonialism can offer only flimsy arguments devoid of human or scientific content to justify its existence and conceal its crimes. These arguments are negated by the very facts which the Portuguese colonialists attempt to conceal. The salient arguments are as follow. Historical rights. Answer. The concept so far as Portuguese Africa is concerned was buried at the Berlin Conference in 1885 by the colonial powers and has, in any case, never been accepted by Africans. B. The process of civilizing the real means and results of which are carefully concealed by Portugal. Answer. The process is being carried out by an underdeveloped country with a lower national income than, for example, Ghana, and which has not as yet been able to solve its own problems. So he's kind of equipping you with how do you address well, it might be just white people, but even black people who tend to also sympathize with white folk, which is you say, look, how in the world could Portugal, its undeveloped country itself, with a lower income than Ghana, be the ones to civilize us? You know, if anything, we should be asking Ghana to civilize us. Well, of course, you know, a lot of people, for some reason, our people are more taken aback from that idea than the idea of Portugal. But let's continue. The colonialist theory of so-called assimilation. This is unacceptable not only in theory but even more in practice. It is based on the racist idea of the incompetence or lack of dignity of African people and implies that African cultures and civilizations have no value. And of course we talk about assimilation and integration in the West, and it's just ironic, right? The idea of creating a multiracial society within the colonies legally based on the native statute, Portuguese apartheid. Answer: this prevents any social contact with the so-called civilized population and reduces 99% of the African population to subhuman conditions. National unity with the colonies, a concept which was hastily brought into the Portuguese constitution as the means of avoiding the responsibilities set out in the United Nations Charter. And of course, again, like I said, the United Nations itself was a negative entity, but you know, you might want to use it just for rhetorical purposes, which this might be. This disgraceful subterfuge totally contradicts all the geographic, historic, ethnic, social, and cultural facts, and it even comes into conflict with the laws prevailing in the colonies concerning their practical relationship with Portugal. F. The state of peace that is claimed by Salazar to exist. In these colonies, Africans have no political rights and cannot form trade unions. Africans do not enjoy even the most elementary human rights, despite a vicious secret police, an inhuman colonial administration, and brutal soldiers and settlers, militia. African nationalist organizations are offering active resistance to Portuguese colonialism. And of course, you have to see in this just how systematic white folk are, you know, in the sense of secret police, inhuman administrations, brutal soldiers, settler militias. This is all that there is. And then, of course, the state of peace that is claimed by Salazar. I don't know who Salazar is, but he could be, you know, he could be just trying to give you that rhetoric. And Cabral is not having it, which is good and great. And this is something that we should emulate all the more. You know, the real situation, it might be asked whether Portuguese colonialism has not done a certain amount of good in Africa, just as it's always relative. For the African who, for 5 centuries, have lived under Portuguese domination. 5 centuries. Portuguese colonialism represents a reign of evil, and where evil reigns, there is no place for good. As for other people, particularly those who fortunately have not known colonial domination, they will first have to acquaint themselves with all the facts before passing judgment. And this is actually pretty important too. You know, this is how it is for us as a people, that us not being personally acquainted with something, you know, we kind of reserve judgment, you know. But it's also interesting because it's like for the Africans who lived Portuguese domination, for you know, we see it as a reign of evil, and you know, it kind of mirrors the rhetoric we see in regards to, you know, the United Snakes, where we say, oh, the lesser of two evils and kind of stuff, you know. But these people who really love truth and justice must overcome the barriers that Portugal sets up against visitors to these colonies. They must go there without allowing themselves to be deceived in any way, and they must carefully study the real situation of the people. They must observe the whole truth of what is happening there, and then they will be able to judge the civilizing influence of Portugal. When they know the truth, these people cannot but realize the desperate situation of Africans in the Portuguese territories. This colonialism is in process of systematically depriving Africans of the most essential requirements for living, and has taken a heavy toll on African lives, suffering, and humiliation. Portugal is an underdeveloped country with 40% illiteracy and with one of the lowest standards of living in Europe. If she could have a civilizing influence on any people, she would be accomplishing a kind of miracle. Colonialism, a historical phenomenon which is now disappearing, has never depended on miracles to keep it alive. Portugal is exercising the only kind of civilizing influence she can, one that corresponds to the type of colonialism she has adopted, and to her position as a colonial power whose economy, culture, and civilization are backwards. But of course, I want people to understand too that this is something that you should expect. If Portugal is not going to Africa to help out strangers. Okay? Portugal is going to Africa to help itself. And it's trying to keep that sort of thing where it wants to help itself. All right? When you talk about 40% illiteracy, low standard of living, and you understand that colonialism can improve the standard of living of the people that are colonizing. That is why it's doing it. You know, so you don't buy the rhetoric, because the rhetoric doesn't make any sense. No one is going to travel thousands of miles away, right, or thousands of kilometers outside of leave their home, right, to just improve the lives of other people with no benefit to themselves. And not to say no one would, but it's be very rare, you know. And of course, if you spend 2 minutes observing somebody, you could tell what they're really after. And Portugal is one of those places, you know. Just the same, like, you know, you spend 2 minutes on the continent, or you spend 2 minutes in the hood or whatever, you know, wherever you go, and you'll see that, you know, these white folk are just looking for, you know, for physical bodies, or they're looking to enslave or something. You know, white people want things, and they move to get them. And of course, that would be the advice that I give to you too. That if you want something, move to get it. So economic misery, both the laws and the concerted action of the settlers and colonial authorities prevent Africans from owning rural or urban property. Most African peasants have to cultivate land which is not officially recognized as belonging to them. In Angola and Mozambique, nearly 70% of the agricultural produce, and in Guinea, the total amount comes from the African cultivators. He is forced to sell his products to the settlers at artificially low prices imposed by the authorities, and these prices are then reduced still further by the buyers. The most fertile areas of land from which Africans have been systematically driven away was used by colonial companies and are now being occupied by European colonatos. In Mozambique, for example, and also he does say what a colonato is, so I'll just, colonato is a group of farms reserved for European settlers. Okay. In Mozambique, for example, 1/5 of the land, that is more than half the cultivated land, is reserved for a small European minority and includes the richest area. In Angola, more than 4/5 of the coffee plantations, bringing a higher revenue than any other product, belongs to settlers who took most of the land from Africans and are now exploiting it with forced African labor. I want to point out something that you really want to pick up on, right? Over here, even though if you followed the last broadcast, you know that he talks about ethnic groups, but over here he just says European and African, right? So this is really what I like about Pan-Africanism. You know, despite the country you're talking about, you know, you don't have to break down you know, this is happening to this group and this is happening to that group. Instead, he says this is happening to Africans. In Angola, this was happening to Africans. In Mozambique, this would happen to Africans. And you see how he universalizes it, making it so that you could see the Pan-Africanism, or you could see that it's all over Africa. He's not just talking about Guinea. He's talking about Angola. He's talking about Mozambique. You know, and that's really important. No, Sao Tome. You know. All right. In Angola, more than 4/5 of the coffee plantation. Yeah. In the Kwanza Valley, Angola alone, more than 100,000 hectares or 220,000 acres of land are reserved for European settlers and colonial companies. In the island of San Tome, nearly all the cultivated land, cocoa and coffee, is in European hands and was taken illegally by the violence of the settlers and the colonial authorities. Tens of thousands of African families, more than 14,000 families in the Colonatos de Sela of Angola, have been driven off their land to make way for farmers from Portugal. Make sure I can hear myself. Alright. Colonial companies all own property which sometimes exceeds hundreds of hectares. The Companhia Angolana de Agricultura, for example, owns about 250,000 hectares, 550,000 acres, of which 17,000 hectares, 37,400 acres, are coffee plantations. The Companhia das Diamantes de Angola is the sole concessionary for diamond mining in that colony. 570,000 Africans in Angola and Mozambique are forced to produce cotton, and about 60,000 peasants, families in Guinea have to grow peanuts. And look at that, they have us cotton picking in Africa. Can you imagine that? While the African people live in misery, the colonial companies and the settlers amass wealth and capital, most of which is taken out of the colonies. To take the year 1957 as an example, during the year, a number of companies, the Sociedade de Agricultura Colonial San Tome, the Banco de Angola, the Compañía de dos Diamantes de Angola, Cabral, Parfina, the Sociedade Agricola de Casequel, Angola, Sena Sugar Estates, or maybe Estados, I don't know, Mozambique, made a net profit which averaged about 49% of their capital. This net profit alone would be sufficient to cover all the public expenditures in Cape Verde, Guinea, and San Tome during 1957, leaving a surplus of 50 million escudos, or 650,000, I guess, in pounds, I don't know. And this sum would also be higher than the amount spent in the same year on public education in Angola. The agricultural and commercial companies, Mario Cunha Angola owns blocks of flats in Lisbon, Portugal, which are worth hundreds of thousands of escudos, and has set up 2 humanitarian foundations where the profits derived from the forced labor, which is really slave labor, of Africans in Angola. So this is actually, I want you to really get a picture of this right here. So what he's saying is this, that there are several companies, right, who if you had these same companies, you could then cover all the public expenditures of your government, as well as public expenditures, including public education, right? However, that's assuming that you keep the same business model, and that business model would have to be forced labor, right? Without the forced labor, right? Maybe you could still cover those, but the reality is that the profits will be less, because the one thing about forced labor, or slave labor, or whatever you want to call it, right, is that you pay your workers less, and by paying your workers less, you can keep more of the profit. Now, that's not something that you want to do, so it's really not a good indication of how viable something is, economically speaking, but it's something that's worth exploring. But another thing I want you to point out too is that, or I want you to understand too, is that a lot of these companies are only successful because they're part of the global economy, or because they're part of the European economy. You know, so like diamonds, for instance, the Europeans and the Europeans have diamond buyers. Sugar, the Europeans have sugar buyers. I don't know what these other companies mean, but I don't know what the other agriculture. The Europeans have agricultural buyers. What you have to do is you have to set up an economy of trade and exchange that way you could have success in these economies. Because the reality is this, that if black folk took over these economies, but white folk didn't engage them, then black folk would collapse these economies. Because it's a market. This is like a market economy, you know. So if white folk are, like, for instance, white folk might engage your sugar company, the sugar company in Mozambique, right? Mozambique is a sugar company. White folk may engage the sugar company because of its cheap sales, and because it's white people negotiating the business deals, right? But if you take away that white person negotiating that business deal, and you put in black folk getting higher wages, therefore the cost of sugar goes up, then there's 2 things against those same white buyers from before engaging you. So I think that's something that I'd like to point out for you guys. Dang, I'm looking at this. All right. So in order to protect Portugal's impoverished industries, the Africans are forced to buy second-rate Portugal products at very high prices, and to sell their products to the settler traders at much lower prices than the latter receive on resale. So it's really important to remember, like, that's what market is. Like, you have to control the market, in a sense, or you have to engage the market. And if you're not doing that, then of course you're going to lose on that end. A lot of what is really economy is engaging this market, and that's what I really want people to understand. You know, just in general, that's something that I would even like if I could meet Cabral, I'd probably be like, yeah, let's talk about markets. You know, not because I'm into markets or anything like that, but more so because it's a part of reality. So wine is one of the most important imports of the Portuguese colonies, usually coming second to textiles. Right? You see what I'm saying? Like wine is an import, you know, but who's importing? Who's exporting wine to Portugal? The Africans have to pay various taxes, among them the sovereignty tax. The so-called native tax provides the largest single contribution to the budget of each of Portugal's colonies. Every African over 15 must pay taxes which often exceed a quarter of his tiny annual income. Now, of course, you know, taxation is actually a normal thing in in like developed communities, developed societies, and actually comes from, I would say it comes from ancient Kemet. You know, one of the things that we tend to forget is that white folk were trying to emulate ancient Kemet. You know, and so like this 25% is kind of within the range that you would expect of anyone. But he puts it here as a complaint in the sense of and it's not. I mean, you know, I mean, which makes sense because you know you're a colony, and you don't want to be a colony. But at the end of the day, you know, I mean, it also makes sense that the colony would be supported by taxes because it's the same with the United States. The United States is like supported, I think like 85% of its income is from uh, personal and business taxes. Uh, Portugal intends to turn these colonies, especially Angola and Mozambique, into so many South Africas to enable her to exploit even more fully their resources and the labor of the Africans. So that's pretty interesting. So I think he's focusing on Portuguese colonies particularly, but he says Europeans, but he also says Portugal. So that's another thing to do. Like he's focusing on war against Portugal, which is also one of the detriments that our people tend to have, which is, well, I shouldn't even say tend to, but one of somebody from Angola, which we all know was one of the greatest Africans of all time, is Nzinga, and she also would focus on Portugal. You know, uh, you know, more so than Europeans. But you know, of course, there's a practicality to it too. You know, like if you're going to war with anything, you have to go to war with the nation. You know, you can't just say I'm going to war with white folk. Uh, I mean, you could say that, but it would be impractical. I mean, yeah, it would be impractical to go to war with every white person at the same time. It's just like I don't know how you win that. You know. Anyway, in order to achieve this aim, she considers the mass immigration of Europeans to be her principal task in Africa and spends large sums of this purpose. So that was Portugal. All right, Portugal. In order to achieve this, in order to achieve this apartheid, right? She considers the mass immigration of Europeans to be her principal task in Africa and spends large sums on this purpose. So a lot of Europeans come to Angola. I mean Portugal and Angola and so forth. So in Angola alone, 500 million escuados are to be spent on the Colando de Sela to build 530 farms in an area of 40,000 hectares. This sum, largely the proceeds of African labor, is equivalent to 20 times the amount spent in Angola by the Agricultural and Forestry Service in 1957. The setting up of each European family cost Angola 1 million escuados. For an African peasant family to earn that much money, they would have to live for 1,000 years and work every year without stopping. So he's saying that the government of of Portugal is funding uh, you know European colonization on black labor, but of course, like that's what you like. That's like who else? What else would they do? That's the question. You know, what else would they do? Why? What else are they going to fund? It's just like what the white man funds his colonization or his like white people fund their like that's what they're supposed to do. You know, I mean you don't agree with it, but that's what they're supposed to do. You know, they're not supposed to pay for other people. Everybody's supposed to pay for themselves, and that's what they're doing. They're paying for themselves. And if they're paying for it on stolen labor, that's on them, you know, or that's on you for having your labor stolen in a sense. You know, you have to organize against that, and that's exactly what he does. You know, Cabral doesn't just talk it, but so it's good that he lays it out. But it's like, yeah, you know, you have to fight the situation. Like, there's no way out because they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. You know, the economic backwardness of Portugal is reflected in the economic and financial life of her colonies. Portugal has never been and never will be capable of creating the necessary foundations for the economic advancement of her colonies, which she's not worried about. Portugal, oh sorry, that's me. So they're not worried about that. Portugal herself is lacking in these basic requirements, and the less impoverished colonies, Angola and Mozambique, now face an economic crisis that Portugal cannot solve. So the social situation of the African population of Angola, Guinea, and Mozambique, 99.7% are classified as uncivilized by Portuguese colonial laws, and 0.3% are considered to be assimilados. For an uncivilized person to attain the status of assimilado, he has to prove his economic stability and a standard of living higher than those enjoyed by a large majority of the population of Portugal. He must live in the European manner, have paid all his taxes, have done his military service, and know how to read and write Portuguese correctly. And most important that you want to look into is done his military service. Well, not most important. Two of them are have paid all his taxes and have done his military service. Some people would want to focus on live in a European manner. Some people want to focus on know how to read and write Portuguese correctly, and that's fine. But this one, because this is another thing that you have to realize too, that if you do these things, like this is what like I don't like to focus on. I tend to say I don't like to focus on America, and then I talk about America, but dang, yo, this thing is. Hey, uh, hold on a second. Anyway, all right. So economic stability. What was I saying? He must live in. Oh yeah. Uh, this is what quote unquote African Americans do. They live in a European manner, pay all their taxes, do their military service, and know how to read and write English correctly. And not just African Americans, but most Africans. Well, I mean, African Americans, what they do is they represent like one of the, uh, I want to say the top, like the most colonized people on the planet. You know, uh, and yeah, like most people would agree that they are like the most colonized people on the planet. So, but you see that this is the objective of colonialism. You know, to have a people uh, live in the ways of the colonizer, pay taxes to the colonizer, all the taxes, do military service for for the colonizer, and read and write as the colonizer wishes for them to read and write. You know, so if the Portuguese people themselves were asked to fill these conditions, well over 50% of the population would not have the necessary requirements for becoming civilized or assimilado. The so-called civilized African is treated as a chattel and is at the mercy of the will and caprice of the colonial administration and the settlers. His situation is absolutely necessary to the existence of the Portuguese colonial system. Uh, Hold on a second. Oh yeah, he provides an inexhaustible supply of forced labor and labor for export. By classifying him as uncivilized, the law gives legal sanction to racial discrimination and provides one of the justifications for Portuguese domination in Africa. The tiny minority of so-called civilized Africans who are theoretically considered to be Portuguese citizens do not enjoy the privileges reserved for Europeans. Some find themselves in an isolated position between the mass of the African people and the settlers and are discriminated against by the latter either in an open or a veiled manner. Most of them actually live in similar conditions to those which are legally imposed on the uncivilized Africans. Portuguese multiracialism is a myth. It really means complete racial segregation, except for contact through work, where it furthers the interest of colonialism, with very few exceptions, such as can also be found in South Africa. There is no social contact between Africans and European families. It is only in the schools and other places outside the family environment that European children come into direct contact with a few assimilado children who attend schools. The children mix together in innocence, but these relationships are so contained. Well, the children mix together in innocence. So the children mix together in innocence, but these relationships also contain prejudices and complexes. Cinemas, cafes, bars, restaurants, and so on are almost exclusively frequented by Europeans. And of course, this is just what you would figure from racial segregation. Any African bold enough to enter one of these places must be prepared to face humiliation. In the town of Lourenço Marques and Vieira, Mozambique, Nova Lisboa, and Lobito, Angola, racial segregation is openly practiced. Portuguese racism hardly existed at the beginning of the period of colonization. It was born and increased as the size of the European population grew. It is no accident that of the 10 million inhabitants of Angola and Mozambique, there are only 60,000 coloreds, and for the past half century, the size of this colored population has remained almost static. Nearly all of them are legitimate children who have been abandoned by European fathers. A mixed couple, especially an African man and a European woman, is always a target for the insults and mockery of the settlers, so much so that the very existing couple do not usually show themselves in public. Very few existing couples. Yeah. And of course, you shouldn't want to be coupling anyway. So I don't really whatever. In country districts, the Africans must suffer very miserable conditions. In the towns, the uncivilized Africans live in areas which are being uh, moved further and further from the town centers. In squalid shanty towns such as the Musex in Luanda, few houses occupied by Africans could be considered as habitable by any standard of decency. They were built by the authorities in a selected area, as in the case in South Africa. After overcoming innumerable obstacles, a few assimilados managed to acquire a reasonably decent home. This is only achieved by the handful of Africans who have been to university and by the ever decreasing number who are able to gain public employment despite racialism. These people are always cited in colonialist propaganda. Most of the Europeans, however, live in vivendas, some of which are real colonial palaces comparable to the richest homes in Portugal, which is, of course, what you would expect. You travel to another land, you get free money, you get to pretty much run the system. Of course, you're going to surround yourself with wealth, right? Uncivilized Africans, especially in the towns, have to carry passes and obey a 9 p.m. curfew. A wise assimilado always carries his identity card, which, when accepted by the authorities and settlers, is his only valid proof of being a human being. Forced labor. 20,000 workers from Angola, Mozambique, and the Cape Verde Islands work 12 hours a day on the settlers' farm of San Tome in the heart of the equatorial zone. There is forced labor for public works in Guinea, Angola, Mozambique, but in the latter two, it extends as well to privately owned companies. So it's for public works and then private companies. Every year, 250,000 Angolans are rented out to agricultural, mining, and construction concerns. Every year, 400,000 people of Mozambique are subjected to forced labor, 100,000 of whom are exported to the mines of South Africa and the Rhodesia. And of course, I don't even know what year this is because he's not really saying the year. But this trade, but it's probably contemporary with him, which is like, just imagine that, just being contemporary to this kind of stuff. Now, of course, we do have this kind of forced labor. If you're talking about, like most people, a lot of people are in America, okay? Like they do have forced labor in America, but in the prison system, you know, and of course they, give you false and bullocks reasons to imprison you, but this is what it is. So this trade in foreign labor provides one of Portugal's most stable sources of foreign currency. Henrique Galvão, a one-time colonial administrator who had had the courage to tell the truth, has stated that only the dead escape forced labor. The present situation is worse than that created by pure slavery. There are employers who have a 30% mortality rate among their workers, and they have never had any trouble obtaining new workers. Can you imagine that? 30% mortality rate. So 30% of the people die, okay, that work for them. And notwithstanding that, they still can get more workers. So they're working people to death, and like African life meant nothing. And of course, this is not too long ago. Well, the book was published in 1979. I don't know when the essay was published, but this was not too long ago. So this is a horrible situation that was going on in Africa, and we have to do something. I mean, so somebody had to do something about it, and Cabral, like I said, did something about it. So the Campania Angolana dos Diamantes alone uses up to 20,000 workers a year. This new form of slavery, for it cannot be considered anything less than that, has broken up millions of African families. And I say, and the thing is this I want to say too is that even though Amilcar Cabral did something about this, some Africans done something about Amilcar Cabral. So it's just mind-boggling. But you know, you have to push forward. So the authorities who hired forced labor make a substantial yearly profit on each man rented out. 75% of the workers' wages are paid when they return to their place of origin, but this is paid by the authorities, not the employers, and the authorities' annual average profit is of the order of about 1,500 escuados, or 1875, whatever, on each man, while the yearly annual net salary is 12,000 escuados, or whatever. This payment is made only. Okay, yeah. So the authorities make more profit than the man makes in salary, right? So this payment is made only after all taxes have been deducted and after the worker gives 15 days of free labor to the state. Theoretically, he is entitled to medical assistance, but in most cases, this scarcely exists. He is also entitled to food, but even Portuguese technicians have established that the diet of the African worker remains deficient in nutritive value. Much forced labor is provided by children and adolescents. Apart from agricultural work, the settlers also use uncivilized Africans for heavy labor and as houseboys. So this is just a terrible situation. Again, they're underfeeding you. They're taking up most of your money. They're doing this to children and adolescents, and they're doing it to, you know, making houseboys and so on and so forth, and heavy labor. And here's the thing too, that we continue this kind of system. You know, this not as bad, but we continue this kind of system. We continue a lot of what's going on in Africa, or what was going on before decolonization, in a sense. You know, that's partly why people say it's neocolonialism. But see, the assimilado worker earns 3 or 4 times less than the European worker who does the same work. He is always a second-class worker, even if skilled, with the exception of a few public employees and a miserably paid wait, worker earns 3 or 4 times less than the European worker who does the same work. He is always, so that's like 25% or 33% on the dollar. Okay, he is always a second class worker, even if skilled. With the exception of a few public employees and miserably paid workers, the assimilados are always fighting the threat of unemployment, and their adult children are mostly unemployed. Even the most unskilled jobs, such as waiter or lottery ticket vendor, are reserved for Europeans. Africans in Angola and Mozambique are not in practice allowed to become taxi drivers or shop salesmen. The African worker has never been allowed to defend himself. The uncivilized are not allowed to organize themselves, and the assimilados have no voice even in Salazar's fascist trade unions. In the farms, mines, and everywhere else, the work schedules are entirely dependent on the goodwill of the employer, leaving the African worker exposed to all the whims and sanctions of the settler, which may include beating. Can you imagine that? Medical care. 380 doctors care for the health of 11 million people who inhabit an area of 2 million square kilometers. Communication in these territories are by far the worst in Africa. In the Cape Verde island, which has unfortunately the greatest number of doctors, there is one doctor for every 10,000 people. In Angola, where the situation is better than in Guinea or Mozambique, there is one hospital for every 280,000 people, one doctor for every 20,000 people, one nurse, and 30 beds for every 10,000 people. The infant mortality rate is to be said to be higher than 40%, and in some regions may attain 80%. Among Africans who died in 1956, 84% of registered deaths were attributed to obscure, unknown causes. But these causes we may not know kill only Africans. From 1940 to 1950, drought and famine in Cape Verde caused the death of about 40,000 people. So, again, like, you know, he's painting this picture of suffering, and you know, it's you know, that's what you would like. This is why you want to have autonomy. This is why you want to have sovereignty, and 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 unfortunately, you know, like a lot of us don't know this experience. You know, we don't know this experience, so it's like we have to be grateful for him to share this experience with us, because a lot of Africans, or not a lot, but I want to say particularly the Africans that might be listening to this broadcast because, you know, they have access to the internet. Uh, a lot, like we don't, like a lot of us don't have it this way. You know, we have higher rates of infant mortality rate, but it's not, 80%. You know what I mean? We have lower access to hospitals, but it's not this. You know, or even like when we go to literacy, we actually have some pretty good literacy. So Catholic missions hold a monopoly on education for the so-called uncivilized Africans, and that's already scary, you know. But that's what it is. Like again, I am encouraging us to engage our people uh, on an educational level, right? And of course, Brother Koku's doing the curriculum, and he's going to engage our people in the same manner. But what I'm saying is that you can't have it be Catholic missions, okay? You can't have it be Catholic missions that has the monopoly on education of our people, you know? So, well, let's keep going. According to the agreement between Portugal and the Vatican, this education must conform to the doctrinal dictates of the Portuguese constitution, and it must take its direction from the plans and programs issued by the local governments. This means that 99.7% of the African population is forbidden access to lay schools. Due to this Catholic monopoly, the educational influence of other Christian missions is small. You know, in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea, 99% of the population is illiterate. Okay, areas larger than Portugal are totally without schools. In 1937, 40,000 children out of the total population of about 4 million attended mission school in Angola. Yet in the same year, in the Belgian Congo, there was 1,300,000 children at elementary school, proportionately 10 times as many as in Angola. The sons of the assimilado, 0.3% of the population, are allowed to attend official elementary schools, secondary schools, and universities, but the various forms of racial discrimination practiced in colonial schools, especially in Mozambique and Angola, added to the great poverty of African families, limit the number of pupils who may graduate. Only those pupils capable of making an extraordinary effort manage to finish their studies. The secondary schools are almost exclusively attended by the sons of the settlers. There are no universities in the colonies. About 100 Africans are in the universities of Portugal or are prepared for university entrance. 100 students out of a population of 11 million. Most elementary school teachers and all secondary teachers are European, except in Cape Verde, where Africans who have diplomas may teach at secondary level. Can you imagine that? All their teachers are European. All Portuguese education disparages the African, his culture, and civilization. African languages are forbidden in schools, and something that you should know is that even to this day, there's like maybe uh, one country in Africa. It might be South Africa, but there's only one country in Africa that has secondary education and that has African language uh, at a secondary education, level in a sense. It's hard to you understand what I'm saying, but of course, like I said, go listen to Bitter Medicine podcast, and he reads about it in one of the papers. But that's what it is, like just forbidden in schools, and this is something that we could fix easily, but we don't. The white man is always presented as superior being and the African as an inferior. The colonial conquistadores are shown as saints and heroes. As soon as African children enter elementary school, they develop an inferiority complex. They learn to fear the white man and to feel ashamed of being Africans. African geography, history, and culture are either ignored or distorted, and children are forced to study Portuguese geography and history. Can you imagine that? Puppets and stooges. Africans have no political rights. But of course, it's not really too hard to imagine, because even in high school, I had an AP European history class. I did not have an AP African history class, and there wasn't even such a thing. I don't even think there's a thing called AP African history in America. So I'm gonna have to. I kind of want to look that up. I want to see if there's such a thing as AP African history. No, like when you try to search it, it says you want to have a petition. Yeah, so it's like change.org kind of stuff. Like, do you want to you don't even have AP African American history. Can you imagine that? Let alone AP African history. But of course you have AP European history. AP means advanced placement for those who might not know. So it's like if you want to take an extra, if you want to go the extra mile and be attractive to colleges and universities, you take AP courses in high school. And so one of those courses would be in European history, but you wouldn't in African history, which is interesting. Puppets and stooges. Africans have no political rights. The old structure of African political life was totally destroyed by the Portuguese colonialism. The few remaining chiefdoms are controlled by the colonial authorities, who use the chiefs as puppets. Most of the chiefs are put in command or communities different from those of which they really belong. Can you imagine that? In the so-called local government council elected by the governor, there are sometimes a few members representing the African people. These men are usually Europeans. The few Africans who accept these positions or are forced to accept them are not entitled to intervene in any way on behalf of African interests. On one occasion, a colored councillor was expelled from the council in Angola for having attempted to criticize the government. One of the very few African doctors in the colonies were invited to take his place. The doctor declined on the grounds that the only thing he knew anything about was medicine. An African priest finally took the post of councillor after being subjected to intimidation and pressure by the Archbishop of Luanda. In the Lisbon Parliament, one of the 120 deputies elected by the government is an African. He is the deputy for San Tome. The deputy for Cape Verde, who is of European descent, is the leader of the fascist political party in the colony and holds his position indefinitely. The representatives for Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea are Europeans closely linked to the large colonial concerns. All the deputies from the colonies enjoy the absolute confidence of the fascist colonial government. They have nothing in common with the Africans, 99.7% of whom, in any event, are not allowed to vote. Not even allowed to vote, but the whole political party is. And when he says fascist, he really means fascist. You know, like we in America, we say, or people outside of, you know, like who are not as deeply colonized, might just say fascism for just giggles or whatever. But this is like actual fascism. So, three Africans are used as political puppets, uh, or as synthetic samples of a non-existent product. But the Portuguese delegation to the United Nations and other international meetings. These three men, the Negro James Pinto Bull, Guinea, the colored Augusto Santos Lima, descendant of Cape Verdeans, and the colored Julio Monteiro, are considered by the countrymen as traitors. They are administrative functionaries in the well-paid service of Portuguese colonialism. And you notice that he says colored, you know? So the Negro would be, colored would be mixed or whatever. All right. So what the Africans want. So we, the Africans of the Portuguese colonies, are fighting Portuguese colonialism to defend the rights of our people, to defend the true interests of people everywhere. The Africans want Portugal to respect and rigidly adhere to the obligations set out in the UN Charter. Now, see, this is the trouble. But see, this is like the compromise right here. You know, he's saying he wants Portugal to respect and rigidly adhere to. Now, obviously, Portugal's not going to do that. But notwithstanding, it might be that he's writing this to a white audience. You know, that would make all the more sense, right? Where he's like, hey, this is the trouble of this white administration, and we want to appeal to, white folk in the sense of, hey, we just want these people to obey their thing. Now, of course, really, you don't want anything from Portugal. You just want Portugal to get out, pack its bags, get out, you know? But, it depends on, like, again, you have to focus on your audience in your communication. So that's one thing. So we demand that Portugal should follow the examples of Britain, France, and Belgium in recognizing the right of the people she dominates to self-determination and independence. The African Anti-Colonialist Organization of the Portuguese colonies represents the legitimate aspirations of their people. Representing the legitimate aspirations of their people, want to reestablish the human dignity of Africans, their freedom, and the right to determine their own future. These organizations want the people to enjoy real social development based on fruitful work and economic progress, on African unity and fraternity, on friendship and equality with all people, including the Portuguese people. They want peace in the service of humanity. So, of course, if you're talking, so like you could tell that the target audience might be Britain, France, and Belgium, right? The UN and all that. So you want to say equality with all people, because you don't want to, because like I said, if you're trying to be war with all white folk, and you write in Britain and France, oh, we just want all these white folk out, we don't want to do any business with white folk, then they're not going to be supporting you. And you might say, oh, I don't need support with them. But the reality is that if they're supporting Portugal, right, then your struggle against Portugal became that much harder, all because you've done, opened your damn mouth. You know what I mean? And that's another thing, like, and that's part and parcel why a lot of us as a people kind of like hold ourselves back, like we're too honest, we're too or we just spill the beans too much. We talk too much. You know, we talk too much, and we don't realize that there's something to gain from not saying everything. Uh, but of course, what happens is that your descendants may look back on your literature and say, oh, this was this was that, so on and so forth. But that's if they don't understand the strategy and the tactics. And the thing is this too that you want to realize too is that white folk understand the strategy and the tactics, so they know you're just saying this so that they don't fight with Portugal. You know what I mean? So it's all a game. Like life is not a game, but it's a game. You know. Uh, so yeah. The African organizations fighting Portuguese colonialism believe in the use of peaceful means for achieving independence. Look at that. However, we have no illusions, and since Portugal intends to use violence to defend her interests, we'll be ready to answer with violence. Our organizations are vigilant. They follow closely all the diplomatic maneuvers of Portugal. They believe that no democratic government will prejudice its own good name by continuing to ally itself with Portuguese colonialism. See, he doesn't want them to be allies, you know, doomed like all other colonial regimes. They believe that the material and human wealth of their countries are part of the patrimony of humanity and should be made to serve the progress and happiness of their own people and of people in all countries. And you notice that he points out, see, he doesn't do what you would do, right? Or I shouldn't say you, but what he doesn't do what a lot of people do, which is, oh, well, white supremacy, and you shouldn't side with white supremacy, or you're part of white supremacy because you help import. Like, you don't. If you're asking for something, right? If you're asking for something, and you are asking for something, right? If you're asking for something, do not villainize the people you're asking. You know, it's like if I want something from you, and of course, you might say, well, only you don't do that well. Sometimes you mock the people. You mock us. You give us crappy voices when you talk to us. And all that stuff. And some of you might be like, I don't even know who you are, Oni. I'm just trying to read this book with you. but I want you to get that, realistically, you don't villainize the people that you're engaging. So you don't say, oh, you're just a white supremacist and this is white supremacy and this is blah blah, and oh, look, Barack Obama, you're doing this, you're doing that, you're a white supremacist, blah blah. Whatever it is that you're saying, and that's just what you're saying right now, whatever, right? Instead, you go, oh yes, we don't want you to side with that side, you know. Don't continue to ally yourself with Portuguese colonialism because they're not as good as you are. You're a good democratic government. Now you know these are not democratic governments. They know they're not democratic governments. But you put out that rhetoric, and their people might read this, you know, like their citizens who are not in power, but they might have an opinion like, oh wait, Portugal's doing all this stuff. Like, this is called PR. This is called propaganda, and he does it excellently. So you gotta give him a round of applause. I can't hear anybody clapping, but give him a round of applause, right? In fact, if you're in the comment section, just write down how you're clapping, Right. So anyway, the Africans and the Portuguese colonies will destroy Portuguese colonialism. It may be the last colonial regime to go, just as it is the last in terms of technical and economic development, and the last to respect the rights of man. But its days are surely numbered. And that was it. That was chapter 3. Obviously, the next chapter is the titular Unity and Struggle. But instead of going to that, I'm going to just end it here, and hopefully everybody enjoyed that reading. It was a nice hour. Thank you for spending that time with me. If you spent the whole hour, much appreciated. If you go back and listen to the remaining, that's also much appreciated. If you share it, if you like, if you subscribe, whatever you do, that's much appreciated. Obviously, if you want to hear more from me, if you're not too familiar with who I am, or if you are familiar with who I am and you want to just get to contact me, my contact information is in the description for this video. I tend to be on Discord. I'm also on Twitter, but I really prefer Discord. So if you want to make an account, get on Discord. There's a bunch of free books you can access. Obviously, you can access this book there too, and it would be wonderful to hear from you. Obviously, I have a YouTube channel. You're listening to it. There's also, we're on a network called KWAZ Radio, and we have Bitter Medicine Podcast, the Harsh Reality Podcast, and the Queen's Council. All excellent platforms. So definitely listen to that. check those out, and you're always going to have something here. So thank you so much for engaging, and hopefully I'll see you another time. Leave a comment if you liked it. Don't leave a comment if you didn't. No, I'm joking. But thank you so much for your time. Shem Hotep.